Well, hello, algebra students. Welcome to the lesson on factoring. Now, this cannot be overestimated that factoring is really one of the most important things that you can learn in algebra because it is so fundamental and often used in all of your other math classes from here onwards. So before we try to factor this trinomial, let's just review a little bit on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side here of the screen. We're going to review multiplying two binomials. So let's say I have an expression like x plus 3 times x minus 5, right? And if I were to distribute this, I'm going to take this whole group here and multiply. I'm going to take this whole group here and I'm going to multiply it by x. So that's going to give me quantity x plus 3 times x, and then take that same group and then multiply it by the negative 5. So that's going to give me quantity x plus 5, x plus 3 times negative 5. And then now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to factor one more time, but instead of factoring out just a single term, I'm going to multiply it out one more time, and I'm going to multiply this x here to both of these terms. So x times x, that gives me x squared. X times 3 is going to give me 3x. Over here, negative 5 times x is going to give me negative 5x, and negative 5 times 3 is going to give me negative 15. And then you can see here that these two here are always going to be like terms, so I'm going to combine them, and I have x squared minus 2x minus 15. Okay? So this gives us a little bit of a review of what's going on. But I want to highlight and point out something very important here, that if you look at these two numbers, the plus 3, the negative 5, it's these two numbers here that control the final result, that produces the coefficients for the middle term and for the last term. And so it's not a coincidence that negative 15 here is the equivalent of positive 3 times negative 5. So we're looking at some patterns here. And negative 2 here, so this is a product, right? The product of these two original numbers. And negative 2 here, this coefficient, this is the sum. This is really positive 3 plus negative 5. Okay? So the product of 3 and negative 5 give us this constant at the end, and the sum of 3 and negative 5 give us this coefficient. And we're going to use this last step here as our insight in order to help us factor, because here what we did was we distributed, and factoring is nothing more than the reverse direction of distributing. So, again, over here, what we did here was we did some distributive property. Distributive. Some of your teachers may call it foiling, multiplying out, whatever it is. It's the distributive property applied twice, once with the group and then once again with the single pieces. So to factor, we're going to do the same process here, but in reverse. So I'm going to look at the constant at the end here and this coefficient, and I'm going to ask myself two numbers that give me a sum of negative 4 and a product of negative 60. So you start listing out all the numbers. So let's write on the side here. We need a sum of negative 4 and a product of negative 60. Okay? And this requires you to do a little bit of guess and checking, but you can guess and check faster if you in fact understand and know your times table and you know how to factor. So the numbers that multiply to give you 60, you can think of like 2 and 30. No, that doesn't. But 2 and 30 that added up together is not going to give you negative 4. Right? Also, another thing here is that since the product is negative, we know that one of the numbers must be positive and the other must be negative. Okay? So 2 and 30, no, that doesn't. 2 and negative 30, no, that doesn't work. Yeah, let's see, what do we got? 3 and 20, that doesn't quite work either. 4 and 15. Okay, so 4 and 15, or negative 15 and positive 4 doesn't quite work either. Um, and if you try to list them all enough, you end up with what works is actually negative 10 and positive 6. These two numbers added together will give you negative 4, and when you multiply them, will give you negative 60. So that's like the last step here, and we're going to work backwards from there. And what we're going to do next is we're going to take this negative 4x, and we're going to split them. So x squared minus 4x minus 60 is the equivalent of x squared minus 10x plus 6x, okay, and then minus 60. So let me separate here what we're trying to do. Okay, so the negative 10x and the positive 6x give us negative 4x. So all I've really done here is applied this idea of finding two numbers with a product of negative 60 and a sum of negative 4. All right. So now I'm going to regroup. I'm going to just draw parentheses around here and just group these first two terms and these second two terms. And then I'm going to do a little bit of factoring. In the first group, I can pull out an x. So that's going to leave me with x minus 10. And in the second group, I can pull out a 6. And that, not so coincidentally, is also going to leave me with x minus 10. And then I'm going to factor one more time, but instead of factoring a single term, I'm going to factor out a group. So I'm going to factor out x minus 10. And what do I have left? X and plus 6. Okay. So x squared minus 4x minus 60 is the equivalent of x minus 10, x plus 6. And you can also see a pattern here that once we figure out what these two numbers are, we could jump straight to the end here. But I highly recommend that you practice listing out these steps here, because by listing them out, you're developing a skill, that is, you're sharpening a skill as well, that's going to be very useful for some much more complicated examples a little bit later on. And you can see, comparing on the left here and on the right, when we're factoring, we're kind of going in one direction, and when we're distributing, it's really going the opposite direction, right? So here we start with a trinomial, we split them, we factor again. Over here, if you go backwards, if you start from the bottom and go upwards, you're really doing the exact same process. Okay? All right, so this is a very brief introduction to factoring. Highly recommend that you practice this with lots of examples as much as you possibly can. The more often, the quicker and the sharper you are with this skill set, the better off you will be in the long run. As always, ask for help if you need it. Thank you for watching, and have a